Chapter 12. Partners. Ever since their marriage in 1938, Babe and George had been constantly on the go, traveling back and forth across the country. They had rented or owned homes in Los Angeles, Denver, and most recently Chicago, where Babe was currently teaching. They never managed to stay in one place long. Despite Babe's restless energy and thirst for glory, she yearned for a permanent home. More than anything, she wanted a place where they could settle down for good. Finally, she convinced George that they should invest their savings and their future in the purchase of an old Florida golf club, which they fixed up and renamed the Tampa Golf and Country Club. Babe's name alone was enough to attract a large membership. They moved south to live in a converted caddy house right on the grounds. Later, they built a large, luxurious home overlooking the golf course. To all appearances, Babe and George were a devoted and playful couple, fiercely loyal to each other. Babe would not tolerate any criticism of George, and yet their closest friends knew that their marriage was troubled and had been for several years. Early in the marriage, George had retired from wrestling and taken over the management of Babe's career. He had been a wonderful help to her, a go-getting promoter and shrewd judge of which moves would help her build her reputation. He knew more about her golf game than anyone. He would go out to the golf course with Babe and watch her practice hour after hour so he could offer suggestions to hone her skills. And he was frequently at her side during tournaments to offer emotional support. "George and I are a team," said Babe. "I lean a lot on his advice." "I truly believe she loved him when she married him," Babe's friend Betty Dodd observed. As the years passed, however, the strains on their marriage began to tell. George worked hard to promote Babe's career, but he missed the recognition and attention he had enjoyed during his active wrestling days. His love of the limelight was as great as his wife's. When he felt that Babe was too full of herself, he would corner her and say, "Listen, Babe, I was a celebrity in my right, and don't you ever forget it." As Babe's fame grew, she became more independent in her career choices and no longer relied solely on her husband's guidance. When she began to negotiate some of her own deals for personal appearances without consulting George, he blew up. George was furious, according to Betty Dodd. He knew he was losing control of her, that she didn't need him. Babe and George both said that they wanted children, but that never came to pass. Babe had at least one miscarriage. She told her friend Peggy Kirk Bell, "I would give up every trophy I ever won if I could have a baby." George said later that they thought of adopting a child, but they were on the road traveling so much of the time, nothing came of that idea. George was a man of gargantuan appetite, a compulsive eater and heavy drinker who gained weight steadily, ballooning to nearly 400 pounds. He would peel the wrapper from a stick of butter and eat it like a banana, drip gravy on his shirt in the restaurant, and sometimes lift the water pitcher off the restaurant table and drink directly out of it. He and Babe had heated arguments about his eating habits, his table manners, and his unkempt appearance. A verbose, good-looking giant of a man when they first met, he had become, as their friend Betty Jameson put it, just a big, fat slob. "I wouldn't want him to come in my house and sit down on the furniture. I don't think I have a heavy enough piece of furniture." Another source of friction was George's uncontrollable wanderlust, the itchy foot, as he called it. He used to say to Babe, "I'm going to get in the car and just go," and bang, he would be off, said Betty Dodd. He might be gone 3 weeks. Babe never knew. They fought often, talked about divorce, and spent much of the time apart. Babe's friends felt that she had outgrown George, that he had become a burden to her, and yet Babe and George never separated permanently and never lost their ironclad loyalty to each other. The tie between them was just too strong. To the press and public, they continued to present themselves as a happily married couple, but those around Babe knew that despite appearances, she wasn't happy. As time went on, she became increasingly lonely. Babe met Betty Dodd for the first time at a golf tournament in Miami, Florida, in 1950. The two women were introduced by Bertha Bowen, who had asked Babe to help Betty improve her golf game. Betty was 19 years old, a lanky redhead with freckles, intense brown eyes, and a winning smile. Babe was 20 years older and at the peak of her career. They found they had a lot in common. "I was pretty much in awe of Babe, who was the outstanding paragon of golf," Betty recalled. When I first saw her, her hair was dyed red, she was wearing a roving egg blue shirt with eyes that matched, and she was outstanding. She was not good looking, but she was strong and striking. The minute I saw her, I knew that had to be the babe. We were introduced, and we struck it off right away, becoming friends from that moment. Betty visited Babe and George at their new home in Tampa, and from then on the two women were constant companions. They developed an intimate friendship, a close and lasting bond that would sustain Babe for the rest of her life. Betty admired Babe and looked up to her. I didn't look on her as an idol, but I admired her ability and athleticism, she recalled. And while Babe rarely spoke about her personal feelings, she apparently saw in Betty the spirited, untamed tomboy that she had been in her own youth. We had such wonderful times, Betty said. I would have walked underground to China for Babe in those days. She was the most famous person in the world, and I was her protege. Babe and Betty became partners in everything they did. The two women traveled almost everywhere together and often played together in tournaments. Betty was a talented guitar player and singer. Babe still had her harmonica, and on tour they would entertain their fellow golfers with impromptu jam sessions. They did have such fun together, said Bertha Bowen. They spoke the same golf language, and they enjoyed the same things. They were downright professional with the mouth organ and the guitar. Begin was the miracle to hear. Babe and Betty were good enough to make recording for Mercury and to appear as a musical duo on several network television shows. Eventually, Betty moved in with the Zachariases and lived with them in their Tampa home. At times, sparks flew between her and George. While George resented the close attachment between his wife and the young golfer, he came to accept the arrangement. He and Babe continued to feud, but they were both unwilling to break up their marriage. More often than not, Betty was the one who smoothed things over and made peace between them. Betty recognized that Babe had conflicting feelings of both affection and hostility for her husband, and she understood that Babe wanted to be known as a happily married woman. She was very loyal to George, said Betty. She didn't want the world to know that she had those kinds of feelings of hostility about George because it had always been the other way. Babe's career, meanwhile, continued to soar. In 1951, she again dominated women's professional golf, winning 7 major tournaments and ending the year as the leading money winner. Newsweek magazine called her Mrs. Golf. Time magazine, guessing at her annual income from tournament winnings, exhibitions, and endorsements, labeled her Big Business Babe. The year 1952 started out with more tournament victories and with a heavy schedule of exhibition matches. That spring, Babe played a cameo role in Pat and Mike, a Hollywood movie starring Katharine Hepburn as a championship golfer and Spencer Tracy as Hepburn's manager and love interest. The original script called for Hepburn to beat Babe in the filmed golf match, but Babe refused to lose, even in the movies, and the script had to be rewritten, allowing her to defeat Hepburn by 1 stroke on the 18th green. Shortly after making the film, Babe entered the hospital in Beaumont to undergo surgery for a strangulated hernia in her left thigh, a painful condition that had been bothering her for some time. She recovered quickly, recuperated at home in Tampa, and was back on the golf circuit by the end of the summer. In October, she won Texas Women's Open in Fort Worth for the 5th time. She was on top of the world again. I felt wonderful, she recalled, but her euphoria didn't last. When the tournament season ended in November, she was exhausted. She went home to Tampa, plagued by persistent fatigue. I wasn't feeling wonderful anymore, she wrote. I wasn't in pain the way I had been before my hernia operation. Mostly, the thing was that I had seemed to be tired all the time. When I played a round of golf, I never felt like I wanted to play another 9 holes. Babe felt certain that with a few weeks of rest, she would snap out of it. But when the tournament circuit started up again in 1953, she still felt lethargic and her game was off. A good round would be followed by a disappointing one. She won just 1 tournament that spring, played 6 in another, and was a runner-up several times. At the Peach Blossom Betsy Ross tournament in South Carolina, she had barely enough energy to finish 18 holes, completely out of the running. Betty and George both urged her to go back to her doctor for a checkup, but first she was determined to make a strong showing in the tournament created in her honor by her hometown, the Babe Zacharias Open in Beaumont. I'll never know where I got the energy to play that tournament, she wrote. She wanted to win so badly that she somehow found the strength she needed and nosed at her old rival Louise Suggs, winning the Babes Zaharias Open by one stroke on the 18th hole. That hometown gallery went wild, she recalled. Betty Dodd and Patty Burge and some of the other girls rushed onto the green and lifted me up in the air. They practically carried me off to the clubhouse. Television cameras were going and everything. But she was too tired to celebrate. As soon as she could get away, she went up to her room in the clubhouse, collapsed on the bed in her golf clothes, and fell asleep. The next morning, she kept her appointment with her family doctor, W.E. Tatum, who had treated Babe for a hernia the year before. As Dr. Tatum examined her, Babe recalled, I could see his face out of the corner of my eye. All of a sudden, he just turned white. He didn't say a word. I guess I just expected all along what my trouble was, I said to him. I've got cancer, haven't I?